Napier George Henry Sturt, the third Baron. Alington navigated the clandestine networks of interwar London while maintaining the public facade of an aristocratic officer. Operating within a highly punitive legal framework, Sturt utilized his properties and immense wealth to shield his high-profile associates, including Prince George, from state prosecution and criminal extortion. Sturt died of pneumonia in Cairo in 1940, and his private archive immediately vanished, prompting enduring historical questions about state-sponsored suppression to protect the British monarchy. The fractured landscape of Britain following the First World War defined the life and the enduring mystery of Napier Sturt, the third Baron Alington. The 1920s and 1930s were an era defined by extreme contradictions. On the surface, the British Empire projected an image of unshakable moral fortitude and rigid class boundaries. The aristocracy retreated into their sprawling country estates and grand Mayfair townhouses, desperate to maintain the illusion of the old world order after the trauma of the trenches. Yet beneath this gilded surface, a profound rebellion was taking root. The younger generation of the elite, often dubbed the bright young things, plunged into an era of frantic hedonism. They used jazz, alcohol, and reckless behavior as an anesthetic against the memories of a devastated Europe. However, this rebellion was strictly monitored by a ruthless legal system. Society demanded a facade of absolute purity from its upper echelons. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, any homosexual acts between men were strictly illegal and carried severe sentences of hard labor. It was the very same law that had destroyed the life of Oscar Wilde decades earlier. For the ordinary man, being caught meant imprisonment and complete social ruin. For the royal family and the highest tier of the aristocracy, any deviation from the moral standard was not merely a personal failing. It was a severe constitutional crisis. The throne depended entirely on the perception of flawless dignity. Within this suffocating environment, London harbored a vast clandestine underground. It was a world sharply divided by class but united by secrecy. On one end were the untouchable elites of Buckingham Palace in Westminster. On the other end were the working-class men of the docks, the railway stations, and the military barracks. For upper-class men who sought the company of working-class youths, a dynamic colloquially known in the underworld as rough trade, the stakes could not have been higher. They needed a secure bridge between these two vastly different worlds. They needed a safe haven far from the prying eyes of the police and the press. Most importantly, they needed a gatekeeper they could trust with their lives, their reputations, and the survival of the empire itself. Napier George Henry Sturt was born in 1896 into the highest and most privileged echelons of British society. Following the death of his father in 1919, he inherited the immense wealth and the prestigious title of the third Baron Alington. From the outside looking in, Lord Alington's life was a perfect portrait of traditional aristocratic duty. He managed vast family estates, attended the most exclusive high society functions, and moved seamlessly through the inner circles of the British establishment. He was wealthy, educated, and well-connected. But Lord Alington was a deeply complex man living a precarious dual existence. He was known among his closest, most trusted confidants to be bisexual, moving freely, but with calculated caution within London's hidden underground circles. His connection to the royal family was not merely formal, it was deeply personal and familial. The Sturts were heavily embedded in the social fabric of the royals. His sister, Lois Sturt, was one of the most famous, documented, and rebellious figures of the era. She famously engaged in a tempestuous affair with Prince George, the Duke of Kent. Through bloodlines, match status, and shared secretive social circles, Lord Alington became a close confidant and a trusted friend to both Prince George and his older brother, the future King Edward VIII. Lord Alington understood the crushing, invisible weight of public expectation. He knew the profound isolation that came with carrying a hereditary title. This shared psychological burden bonded him intrinsically to the royals. But while a baron might occasionally risk a localized scandal, a king and a prince could not afford even a whisper of impropriety. The human experience is frequently defined by its stark contradictions. For Lord Alington, the sterile, highly orchestrated, and polite interactions of aristocratic drawing rooms offered little comfort or genuine connection. Like many men of his class and specific disposition, he was strongly drawn to the gritty reality of the rough trade. Many historians and biographers of the period suggest that he regularly scoured the docks, the East End slums, and the working-class districts of London. He sought out sailors, off-duty guardsmen, and men hardened by the unforgiving streets. Rather than a simple act of exploitation, these fleeting, inherently dangerous encounters temporarily collapsed the rigid, ironclad barriers of the British class system. Lord Alington provided a physical space where titles, crowns, and social standing did not matter. His sprawling, highly secure residences essentially became heavily guarded sanctuaries. But historical accounts indicate he did not just open his heavy oak doors for his own personal desires. He opened them for his most powerful friends. It is at this juncture that official history blurs with heavily guarded state secrets. Navigating this space requires immense care. Absolute certainty is difficult to establish when powerful institutions have a vested historical interest in absolute silence. However, numerous historians and persistent credible whispers from the era suggest that Lord Alington acted as a high-level fixer and procurer for the royal family. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, remains one of the most controversial figures in modern British royal history. Many historians agree that he lived a highly active bisexual lifestyle, engaging in dangerous liaisons with both men and women. He was known to frequent the underground drug scene and was reportedly subject to severe blackmail attempts on several occasions. King Edward VIII's private life was equally fraught with controversy, marked by a reckless disregard for consequence and tradition. According to the prevailing theories surrounding Lord Alington's inner circle, the Baron took on the incredibly dangerous role of sourcing companions for these royal figures. It is alleged that he brought working-class men, the rough trade of the docks and barracks, into his private estate to host intimate, highly secretive gatherings for the king and the prince. In these hidden rooms, shielded by the Baron's protection, the immense weight of the crown was cast aside. The men who ruled a global empire allegedly engaged in liaisons with the very men who survived at the absolute bottom of its social and economic ladder. Because of the severe legal and constitutional implications of these acts, such claims remain officially unverified in state archives. We cannot state with unquestionable certainty the exact frequency, the specific attendees, or the explicit nature of every gathering held at the Alington estate. Yet the circumstantial evidence of the era cannot be ignored. We know that the royal family relied heavily on fixers and large sums of money to buy back blackmail letters from male prostitutes during this exact period. This context lends heavy weight to the rumors surrounding Lord Alington's specific role. He held the secrets, he knew the names, he possessed the physical evidence that held the power to completely destroy the empire's moral reputation on the global stage. By 1940, the geopolitical landscape had violently shifted. The world was engulfed in the Second World War. The frivolous, decadent days of the Roaring Twenties were dead and buried. Napier Sturt, Lord Alington, answered the call of duty, utilizing his aviation experience to serve as an officer in the Royal Air Force. He was stationed in Cairo, Egypt, serving the very empire whose darkest secrets he harbored. Tragically and abruptly, his life was cut short. He contracted severe pneumonia and died while on active service in 1940, at the relatively young age of 44. His death was officially announced and publicly mourned as the tragic loss of a noble patriot and a dedicated servant of the crown. If Lord Alington had kept personal diaries, possessed letters from Prince George, or held photographs of the clandestine gatherings at his estate, those unattended documents posed an immediate and catastrophic national security threat to the royal family's standing during wartime. What allegedly followed is one of the most enduring dark legends in the history of British intelligence. It is widely claimed by researchers of the period that almost immediately after news of his death reached London, a covert team of MI5 operatives was dispatched. Under the cover of darkness, they allegedly raided Lord Alington's properties. They broke into private safes, cleared out locked desks, and confiscated thousands of pages of private documents, correspondence, and photographs. Rather than filing these sensitive documents away in government archives for future historical record, the agents supposedly consigned the entire collection to the fire. Photographs of royals with working-class men, intimate letters, and the true identities of the men who visited the estate were burned to ash in a single, ruthless night operation. We lack the official MI5 dispatch ordering this raid, as the fundamental purpose of such an operation is to leave no paper trail. But the complete unnatural absence of Lord Alington's personal private papers from all historical archives speaks volumes. Many historians argue that the terrifying speed and ruthlessness of this alleged operation perfectly demonstrate how the British establishment protected its own at any cost. The legacy of Lord Alington forces us to confront a cold, difficult reality about the nature of history itself. History is not merely what is carefully written down and preserved in museums. It is equally shaped by what has been deliberately destroyed. Lord Alington took his deepest, most profound secrets to the grave, leaving behind only the polished veneer of a war hero. The royal family, positioned as the ultimate symbols of moral authority, allegedly relied on this loyal friend to facilitate their most illicit desires, drawing from the most vulnerable, impoverished classes of society. And when that friend died, the immense apparatus of the state was weaponized. The immense apparatus of the state was weaponized solely to protect the powerful from the very laws they imposed. The ashes left behind in 1940 represent the silenced voices of the working class men who passed through his doors, and they stand as a sharp, enduring reminder that the most profound secrets of the elite do not simply fade away. They are actively incinerated by those with the power to control the narrative. The Operation Napier Sturt relied entirely on the physical reality of London in the 1920s and 30s. Beyond the pristine gaslit avenues of Mayfair and the imposing iron gates of Buckingham Palace lay a vast, labyrinthine metropolis, suffocating beneath a blanket of industrial smog. The Thames River was a working artery choked with coal barges and cargo ships, bordered by miles of grimy docks, towering warehouses, and the desperate poverty of the East End. It was within this specific geography where the wealth of the empire met the extreme deprivation of its working class that Lord Alington operated. For the men of the docks, the off-duty guardsmen, and the transient laborers, life in interwar Britain was a brutal exercise in survival. The Great Depression had cast a long, dark shadow over the country. Unemployment was rampant, and a few extra shillings could mean the difference between freezing in a tenement or eating a hot meal. When an elegantly dressed gentleman approached a hardened sailor in a dimly lit pub near Wapping, the dynamic relied entirely on severe economic inequality. Yet historical accounts of the rough trade subculture suggest it was also more complex than simple exploitation. For many working-class men, these encounters offered a fleeting taste of a world they were entirely barred from, a world of warmth, fine liquor, and undivided attention from a man of power. Lord Alington, by all accounts, was not a crude predator who forced his way through the slums. He possessed the refined charm and the disarming manners of his class. He knew how to navigate the hostile, hyper-masculine environments of the dockland pubs without appearing entirely out of place. He was the golden bridge. He would identify the men, establish a quiet rapport, and offer them an invitation that carried the unspoken promise of discretion and financial reward. The journey from the freezing, fog-drenched streets of the East End to the heavily guarded sanctuary of an aristocratic townhouse was a sensory shock. Within these walls, a profound psychological transformation occurred. The rigid, suffocating uniforms of British society were literally and figuratively stripped away. The Lord was no longer bound by the exhausting etiquette of the House of Lords. The sailor was no longer defined by his poverty. In the quiet, luxurious confines of Alington's drawing rooms, they were engaged in a shared, highly illegal rebellion. The intimacy of their shared criminality created a bizarre temporary equality. It was this precise environment, safe, luxurious, and completely detached from the moral judgment of the outside world, that Lord Alington meticulously cultivated. And it was this environment that he offered to the most vulnerable, yet most powerful men in the British Empire, the male heirs to the throne. Enter Prince George, the Duke of Kent. History remembers him as the most glamorous, intelligent, and deeply troubled of King George V's sons. He possessed a restless, artistic spirit that constantly chafed against the crushing boredom of royal duty. He was also a man consumed by voracious, reckless appetites. Official biographies and state archives heavily sanitize his life, but the persistent, well-documented whispers of his contemporaries paint a very different picture. Prince George struggled profoundly with addiction, heavily indulging in morphine and cocaine during the late 1920s. His bisexuality was an open secret among the elite, but his approach to it was alarmingly careless. He chased adrenaline. He sought out dangerous liaisons, often writing highly explicit, deeply compromising letters to his lovers, both aristocratic and working class. For a man in Prince George's position, this recklessness was tantamount to treason. If a single letter or a single photograph of the king's son in a compromising position with a male prostitute reached the press, or worse, foreign intelligence services, the ensuing scandal could have irreparably damaged the monarchy. The British public, still recovering from the slaughter of the First World War, demanded absolute moral fortitude from their royals. They would not have tolerated a prince who funded the criminal underworld to feed his addictions and desires. This is where Napier Sturt became indispensable. The prince needed the thrill of the underground, but he desperately required an absolute firewall between his nocturnal activities and his public royal persona. Lord Alington was that firewall. He was the trusted buffer who absorbed all the physical and reputational risk. When the prince desired the company of the rough trade, he did not have to risk walking the docks himself. He simply retreated to the impenetrable safety of Lord Alington's estate. The mechanics of this royal protection were highly calculated. Alington managed the logistics with the precision of a military campaign. He handled the vetting process. He ensured that the working class men brought into the house understood the absolute necessity of silence, even if they never fully realized the true identity of the royal guests they were entertaining. Names were not exchanged, or if they were false. In the dim light of the estate, a prince could simply be another wealthy friend of the baron. Most importantly, Lord Alington handled the money. The shadow of blackmail loomed constantly over the homosexual underground of 1930s London. Professional blackmailers, known in the slang of the time as the renters, made lucrative careers out of seducing wealthy men, stealing personal items or writing down addresses, and then demanding exorbitant sums for their silence. It was an incredibly common, terrifying threat that drove many high-profile men to ruin or suicide. By acting as the middleman, Alington ensured that the royal family was entirely insulated from this sordid reality. If a sailor or a guardsman demanded payment or threatened exposure, they dealt exclusively with Lord Alington. The baron possessed the wealth to pay them off, and the aristocratic connections to quietly intimidate them if necessary. The royals never had to touch the dirty money, and their names never had to enter the transaction. It is staggering to consider the immense psychological toll this must have taken on Napier Sturt. To the outside world, he was expected to project the image of a carefree, slightly eccentric bachelor lord. He attended state banquets, he rode to hounds, and he participated in the endless, performative rituals of the upper class. But beneath that polished veneer, he was carrying the darkest, most volatile secrets of the British establishment. He was the keeper of the keys to a kingdom of forbidden desire. Every time he brought a man from the street into his home, he was risking a prison sentence of hard labor. Every time he facilitated a meeting for the Duke of Kent or the future king, he was risking the total collapse of his family's ancient name. The isolation of this existence must have been profound. He could never truly confide in anyone outside of his immediate, highly complicit inner circle. He was surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet he lived in a constant state of high alert, knowing that a single slip of the tongue by a drunken sailor or a sudden police raid could bring the entire gilded roof crashing down on his head. The Metropolitan Police, for their part, generally turned a blind eye to the private vices of the extreme elite, provided they remained strictly behind closed doors. The unwritten rule of the British establishment was that hypocrisy was entirely acceptable, so long as the public illusion of morality was maintained. But this was a fragile, precarious ecosystem. It relied entirely on the continued silence and the steady hand of the man at the center of the web. As the 1930s drew to a close and the storm clouds of fascism gathered over Europe, the days of this reckless, clandestine indulgence were violently numbered. The world was about to change irrevocably, and the secrets held within Lord Alington's velvet-draped rooms would soon become a severe matter of national security. The transition from the decadent peace of the 1930s into the devastating reality of the Second World War was abrupt and absolute. For the British aristocracy, the outbreak of war in September 1939 marked the definitive end of an era. The sprawling country estates were quickly requisitioned for military hospitals and command centers. The grand London townhouses were shuttered, their windows taped against the imminent threat of the Blitz. The clandestine, hedonistic underground that Napier Sturt had so carefully navigated and protected was instantly overshadowed by a desperate fight for national survival. Lord Alington, despite his complex private life and the immense volatile secrets he carried, was fundamentally a product of his class. Duty to the empire was an ingrained, unquestionable expectation. He had already served his country in his youth, and now at the age of 43, he returned to the military. He joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. Given his aristocratic background, his wealth, and his extensive social connections, he was swiftly commissioned as an officer. By early 1940, Napier Sturt was deployed to Cairo, Egypt. At this time, Cairo was a critical, high-stakes nerve center for the British war effort in the Middle East. It was a complex, bustling city overflowing with military brass, intelligence officers, exiled European royalty, and a massive influx of Allied troops. It was a place of high tension and constant frantic activity, a stark contrast to the guarded, velvet-lined sanctuaries of his London life. Deployed thousands of miles away from the heavily fortified center of his secret world, Lord Alington left behind the meticulously arranged gatherings and the constant threat of blackmail in a city that was bracing for relentless aerial bombardment. However, the physical distance did not erase the reality of what he had facilitated for over a decade. The physical evidence of those years, the letters, the photographs, the personal diaries, presumably remained locked tightly away in his private safes back in England. While serving in Cairo, Lord Alington's life took a sudden and fatal turn. The cause was not enemy fire or a covert assassination, but something far more mundane and tragically common. He contracted a severe case of pneumonia. In the era before the widespread availability of antibiotics, pneumonia was a swift, brutal, and often unstoppable killer. Despite receiving military medical care, his condition deteriorated rapidly. On the 16th of September 1940, Napier George Henry Sturt, the 3rd Baron Alington, died in a hospital in Cairo. He was 44 years old. The official reaction to his death was exactly what one would expect for a nobleman dying in service to his country. Formal obituaries in the British press highlighted his long, distinguished lineage. They praised his unwavering sense of duty. They mourned the loss of a prominent, well-liked figure in high society. To the broader British public, he was simply another tragic casualty of a devastating global conflict. He was buried with honors in the Cairo War Memorial Cemetery, resting quietly among thousands of other British and Commonwealth servicemen. Yet, the private reaction within the highest echelons of the British establishment was drastically different. When the telegram announcing Lord Alington's death reached London, it is widely believed by historical researchers to have triggered a state of profound, unprecedented alarm within Buckingham Palace and the corridors of Whitehall. The rapidly shifting dynamics of the royal family contextualize the sheer scale of this panic. By 1940, King Edward VIII, the frequent beneficiary of Alington's extreme discretion, had famously abdicated the throne. He was now the Duke of Windsor, a figure viewed with deep, agonizing suspicion by the British government due to his perceived sympathies towards Nazi Germany. His younger, more reserved brother, King George VI, was now burdened with the throne. George VI was desperately trying to project an image of stoic, unwavering moral stability to a nation under literal siege. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was still undertaking highly visible official royal duties, but his past indiscretions remained a constant, terrifying vulnerability. If Lord Alington was indeed the central, organizing hub of their underground lives, his sudden death represented a catastrophic security breach. A fixer is only valuable as long as he is alive to actively manage the secrets. In death, he loses all control over his physical assets. Under normal circumstances, the private papers of a deceased nobleman would pass directly to his heirs or legal executors. These executors would have a strict legal obligation to painstakingly catalog his belongings, open his locked safes, and review his personal correspondence. The sheer thought of an independent solicitor, or worse, a disgruntled family member, discovering letters detailing the sexual exploits of the king's brother with working-class men was unimaginable to the establishment. In 1940, British morale was hanging by a delicate thread. The nation was enduring the nightly horrors of the Blitz. The idea that the highest members of the social order were previously engaging in illegal, heavily stigmatized acts with the most vulnerable members of society would have been a devastating blow to national unity. It was not merely viewed as a family embarrassment, it was treated as a matter of supreme critical national security. This is the precise context that surrounds the infamous, alleged midnight raid. According to persistent historical accounts and the dedicated research of modern biographers, the British intelligence apparatus did not wait for the standard legal processes to unfold. Many historians suggest that MI5, the Domestic Security Service, was immediately and quietly tasked with neutralizing the threat. The operation was reportedly executed with ruthless, silent efficiency. Under the dense protective cover of wartime blackouts, teams of operatives are said to have descended upon Lord Alington's properties in London and his expansive country estate. The goal was singular and absolute: locate, confiscate, and destroy any piece of paper that connected the royal family to the underground world of the 1920s and 30s. It is crucial to emphasize that official, unredacted records of such an operation are, unsurprisingly, not available in the National Archives. We cannot definitively state the names of the commanding officers or the exact hour the heavy oak doors were breached. However, the complete surgical eradication of a prominent nobleman's personal archive is highly anomalous. Men of Alington's vast stature typically leave behind voluminous historical records, decades of financial ledgers, extensive social correspondence, and deeply personal diaries. The fact that his inner private life has been almost entirely scrubbed from the historical record provides compelling, albeit circumstantial, evidence of a deliberate, highly organized, state-sponsored cleansing. If the historical whispers are accurate, the intelligence operatives would have systematically cracked the steel safes. They would have emptied the hidden, locked compartments of his mahogany desks. They were not looking for state secrets or enemy codes. They were hunting for deeply personal, highly compromising human stories. They were searching for photographs of royal princes in the relaxed company of unidentified sailors. They were looking for frantic letters discussing blackmail payments. They were hunting for lists of names from the impoverished docklands. These documents represented the fragile, dangerous bridge that Alington had spent years building. And in a matter of hours, that bridge was violently dismantled. The collected materials were allegedly burned, reduced entirely to ash, to ensure that the secrets of the throne would never face the scrutiny of the public or the harsh judgment of history. The fire consumed not only the hard evidence of royal indiscretion, but also the only remaining records of the working-class men who had briefly, dangerously stepped into the gilded cage. The destruction of these papers was an act of profound, deliberate historical erasure. It perfectly illustrates the sheer, unchecked power of the British establishment during this era. The law was a rigid, unforgiving instrument when applied to the ordinary citizen on the street. But when the reputation and the survival of the crown were at stake, the law was quietly bypassed and the state's intelligence agencies were repurposed as a royal cleanup crew. Napier Sturt had fiercely protected his friends in life, and the state ensured with ruthless precision that his silence remained absolute in death. The morning after the alleged raid on the Alington estates, the physical reality of the extraction was stark. A heavy silence followed this deliberate, violent erasure. When the legally appointed executors eventually arrived to assess the vast holdings of the deceased 3rd Baron Alington, they would have found the mahogany desks hollowed out, the heavy iron safes designed to withstand fire and theft would have been systematically emptied of their most sensitive contents. The scent of recently extinguished ash might have still lingered in the grand fireplaces of his London townhouse. The men who likely ordered and executed this operation were not faceless bureaucrats. They were part of the very same aristocratic machine that had produced Napier Sturt. The directors of British intelligence, the senior government ministers, and the courtiers of Buckingham Palace had attended the same elite boarding schools. They belonged to the same exclusive gentlemen's clubs in St. James's. They understood the complex, unspoken rules of their class perfectly. The decision to eradicate Lord Alington's private archive was not an act of bureaucratic housekeeping. It was an act of ruthless class solidarity. They were destroying his personal history in order to permanently secure their own. This systemic instinct for self-preservation was not a new phenomenon forged in the panic of the Second World War. The British establishment had a long, well-documented history of protecting its most powerful figures from the severe moral laws they imposed upon the rest of the nation. We must view the Alington cover-up not as an isolated incident, but as the grim evolution of a long-standing tradition. A half-century earlier, in 1889, the notorious Cleveland Street scandal had shaken the very foundations of Victorian society. In that instance, a male brothel in London was discovered by the police, revealing that aristocratic patrons, reportedly including individuals closely tied to the royal family, had been paying working-class telegraph boys for sexual services. The government's response then was identical in its intent: stall the police investigation, allow the wealthy patrons to quietly flee the country, and ensure the royal name was heavily shielded from the resulting court cases. The law, with all its punitive weight, fell only upon the boys and the brothel keepers. By the time Lord Alington was allegedly operating his clandestine sanctuary in the 1930s, the stakes had evolved, but the mechanism of power remained unchanged. The establishment had simply become more efficient at managing its vulnerabilities. Alington was a highly effective buffer, absorbing the risk on behalf of the crown. When he died suddenly in Cairo, that buffer disintegrated. The state did not hesitate to employ its wartime intelligence apparatus to permanently seal the breach. The speed of the alleged MI5 raid was a testament to the absolute terror the establishment felt at the prospect of the public discovering that the Cleveland Street dynamic was still thriving in the heart of Mayfair. The psychological aftermath of Lord Alington's sudden death sent profound shockwaves through the surviving members of his hidden circle. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, had just lost one of his most trusted confidants, a man who had provided an impenetrable fortress for his most dangerous desires. Without Alington, the prince was left dangerously exposed. The Duke of Kent's own life would end tragically and abruptly just 2 years later. In August 1942, a military flying boat carrying the prince crashed into a Scottish mountainside under heavily debated circumstances, killing him instantly. Like Alington, he died in uniform, serving his country during its darkest hour. And much like Alington, his death immediately triggered an intense, highly secretive government operation to secure his personal effects. The establishment moved swiftly to sanitize the prince's legacy, ensuring that he would be remembered solely as a royal martyr of the war. The tragic parallel between the two friends is difficult to ignore. Both men lived lives of extreme, dangerous contradiction, and both men had the messy, illicit truths of their humanity carefully managed and suppressed by the state the moment they drew their last breaths. But what of the other men left behind? What of the sailors, the guardsmen, and the transient laborers who had passed through the heavy doors of the Alington estate? The tragedy of this historical erasure falls heaviest upon them. When the Second World War ended, the surviving working-class men returned to a society that continued to fiercely criminalize their existence. Unlike the aristocrats who could retreat to foreign villas or rely on high-level fixers, these men had no safety net. They faced constant police harassment, the terrifying threat of imprisonment, and the complete destruction of their livelihoods if their true nature was ever discovered. The ashes left in Lord Alington's fireplaces represented the literal incineration of their stories. Because they were poor, because they were working class, and because their desires were illegal, they were entirely voiceless. the letters they might have written, the photographs they might have appeared in alongside men of immense power, these were the only tangible proofs that their lives had intersected with the highest echelons of the empire. By destroying the Alington archive, the British state did not just protect the monarchy, it actively deleted the working-class queer experience from the historical record. They were relegated back to the shadows, their brief moments of forbidden equality erased as if they had never happened at all. The deliberate destruction of primary sources creates a profound challenge for modern historians researching the life of Napier Sturt. In historical research, this phenomenon is defined as archival silence. When investigating figures like Lord Alington, the absence of evidence is, in itself, a crucial piece of evidence. Historians are forced to read the negative space. We cannot examine Alington's personal diaries, so we must painstakingly cross-reference the diaries and memoirs of his contemporaries. We look for the gaps in the official records. We examine the heavily redacted police files from the 1930s regarding blackmail rings, noting the sudden, unexplained cessation of certain investigations when the trail led too close to Mayfair. We find traces of Alington in the guarded, coded language used in the letters of the bright young things. His contemporaries wrote about him with an affection and a careful discretion that strongly implies a shared dangerous knowledge. We look at the architectural security of his properties, designed not just for grandeur, but for absolute privacy and the prevention of unauthorized entry. Furthermore, we must rely on the persistent oral histories and the deep-rooted rumors that circulated within the London Underground and the upper class alike. While oral history and rumor can never be treated as absolute, verified fact, when the same specific narratives concerning a highly connected aristocratic fixer and the royal family persist across decades, despite the state's best efforts to silence them, they demand serious, critical examination. The establishment can burn the paper, but it cannot entirely extinguish human memory. The life of Lord Alington forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that written history is often a curated narrative, carefully managed by those holding the monopoly on power. We are taught to revere the archives, to trust the official documents filed away in government vaults. But the story of Napier Sturt reminds us that we must also question what is missing from those vaults. The preservation of the British Empire's dignity required the active, ruthless suppression of its citizens' truths. Lord Alington was a willing participant in this system, using his wealth and privilege to carve out a sanctuary of defiance. Yet, in the end, the very system he served turned its devastating efficiency against his legacy. He became a ghost in his own narrative, leaving behind a legacy defined not by his own words, but by the desperate silence of the state that feared him. The intense pressure under which Napier Sturt lived was generated by the specific legal machinery that made his role as a royal protector desperately necessary. The threat hanging over the British elite in the 1930s extended far beyond public embarrassment. It was the very real threat of targeted systemic extortion. In 1885, the British Parliament passed the Labouchere Amendment. This brief, sweeping piece of legislation criminalized all acts of gross indecency between men, whether committed in public or in the absolute privacy of one's own home. Almost immediately, this law became known within the legal profession and the criminal underworld by a much darker name, the Blackmailers Charter. Because the law applied to actions performed behind locked doors, it created a massive, unregulated industry of extortion. A young man from the docks or a soldier on leave needed only to threaten to go to the police with a story, true or fabricated, to instantly ruin a wealthy gentleman. The courts were notoriously unforgiving and the press was merciless. For an ordinary aristocrat, a whispered accusation meant social exile, financial ruin, and a likely prison sentence. For the royal family, an accusation meant a constitutional catastrophe. This was the terrifying landscape that Prince George and King Edward VIII navigated. They were men of immense privilege, but their private desires made them uniquely vulnerable to the most desperate and opportunistic members of society. In the dim light of a London pub or a shadowed park, a royal prince was no longer a sovereign untouchable. He was a highly lucrative target. The British establishment quietly managed a massive volume of blackmail during this period. Historical accounts from retired police officers and legal scholars suggest that paying off extortionists was a regular, albeit highly secretive, function of the royal household's peripheral staff. Large sums of money frequently changed hands to retrieve compromising letters, pawned pocket watches bearing royal crests, and signed photographs. But relying on lawyers or palace aides to negotiate with hardened street criminals was inherently dangerous. The circle of knowledge was too wide. There were too many opportunities for a leak. This is precisely why Lord Alington was invaluable. He did not operate as an official employee of the state. He was a peer of the realm, bound to the crown by bloodlines and unspoken loyalties. He operated entirely outside the bureaucratic channels of the palace. If a guardsman decided to demand £1,000 for a letter written by Prince George, the guardsman did not knock on the gates of Buckingham Palace. He was directed to Lord Alington. Alington possessed the immense personal wealth required to settle these debts quietly without drawing from royal accounts that might be audited or questioned. More importantly, he possessed the social authority to intimidate. A threat made by a working-class youth against a royal prince was dangerous. A threat made against a wealthy, connected baron on his own heavily guarded territory was a much riskier proposition. Alington absorbed the friction between the crown and the street. He was the shock absorber for the monarchy's most reckless behaviors. The physical spaces Napier Sturt inhabited illustrate the severe personal toll of his dual existence. His family's ancestral seat was Cryshel House, a sprawling, magnificent estate in Dorset, set among thousands of acres of rolling parkland. It was a monument to the Sturt family's historical power and respectability. Here, Alington was expected to play the role of the benevolent landlord, hosting shooting parties for the local gentry and maintaining the rigid traditions of rural aristocratic life. Yet the contrast between the sunlit lawns of Cryshel House and the heavy velvet-draped rooms of his London properties could not have been starker. He was effectively living two entirely separate lives, partitioned by geography and necessity. In Dorset, he was the public face of British morality. In London, he was the architect of its subversion. The psychological strain of maintaining this absolute division must have been exhausting. He was surrounded constantly by people, servants, aristocratic peers, and the transient men of the underground. Yet, he was profoundly isolated. He could never fully drop his guard. He could never afford a moment of true, uncalculated vulnerability, because the secrets he held did not belong solely to him. They belonged to the empire. The events of 1936 exposed the extreme vulnerability of Alington's position. That year, the British establishment demonstrated its ruthlessness in defending the crown. King Edward VIII, Alington's close friend and alleged beneficiary of his discreet services, triggered the abdication crisis through his determination to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American. This action fundamentally fractured the government. In response, the establishment, led by the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, issued an absolute ultimatum: abandon the marriage or abdicate the throne. The abdication of King Edward VIII sent a chilling, unmistakable message to everyone in the royal inner circle. The establishment had just forcibly removed a highly popular king over a heterosexual romance with a divorced woman because it violated the strict moral code of the Church of England. If the government was willing to tear the monarchy in half over Wallis Simpson, one can only imagine the apocalyptic, destructive force they would have unleashed if they had discovered the true nature of the gatherings at Lord Alington's estate. If the public had learned that the king's brother, Prince George, was engaging in illegal homosexual acts with working-class men procured by a baron, the resulting scandal would not merely have forced an abdication. It could have sparked a serious Republican movement. The entire institution of the British monarchy, already fragile and recovering from the economic devastation of the Great Depression, could have collapsed under the weight of such profound hypocrisy. Napier Sturt watched the abdication crisis unfold from the very center of the storm. He saw his friend stripped of his title and exiled to France. He saw the cold, mechanical efficiency with which the British state excised a perceived moral tumor to protect the host body. He must have known, with absolute terrifying certainty, that if his own secrets were ever exposed, the establishment would not hesitate to destroy him with the exact same ruthless precision. He was protecting a system that would crush him without a second thought if his utility ever expired. This deepens the tragedy of the men he brought into his homes: the sailors, the off-duty soldiers, the laborers from the East End. They were entirely unaware of the massive geopolitical tightrope they were walking on. For them, an evening at Lord Alington's townhouse was a brief reprieve from the grinding poverty of the 1930s. It was a hot meal, expensive alcohol, and perhaps a few pounds slipped quietly into a coat pocket. They were seeking survival and brief moments of human connection in a city that viewed them as largely disposable labor. They did not know that their presence in those rooms constituted a severe national security threat. They did not know that they were temporary players in a high-stakes game of royal protection. When the war finally broke out, these very same working-class men were drafted into the infantry and the navy. They were sent to the beaches of Normandy, the jungles of Burma, and the freezing waters of the North Atlantic to fight and die for the very empire that criminalized their existence and relied on Lord Alington to hide their faces. The war acted as the great devastating equalizer. The heavy bombs of the Luftwaffe did not distinguish between the slums of the East End and the grand townhouses of Mayfair. The clandestine world that Alington had managed was physically blown apart by the Blitz. But the war also provided the perfect cover for the ultimate act of historical erasure. In peacetime, the sudden death of a prominent baron and a subsequent secretive raid by intelligence officers on his private estate would have raised questions. It might have sparked a parliamentary inquiry or relentless journalistic investigation. But in the autumn of 1940, Britain was fighting for its very survival. The public was consumed by casualty lists, rationing, and the nightly terror of air raids. No one was paying attention to the quiet movements of MI5 agents in the dark. The chaos of a global conflict provided the British establishment with the perfect, impenetrable smokescreen to execute their cleanup operation. They used the noise of the war to permanently silence the whispers of the past. Napier Sturt died defending a nation that immediately moved to obliterate the truth of his life, ensuring that his legacy and the identities of the vulnerable men he harbored would be forever lost in the fog of history. The sheer mechanics of this historical erasure relied entirely on the suffocating atmosphere of London in the autumn of 1940. The capital of the empire was a city plunged into total mandatory darkness. The blackout regulations strictly enforced to thwart the nightly bombing raids of the German Luftwaffe transformed London into a pitch-black labyrinth. Streetlights were extinguished. Vehicle headlights were fitted with heavy slitted covers, and heavy blackout curtains were nailed shut across every window in the city. To show even a sliver of light was to invite destruction from the sky. It was under this impenetrable cloak of wartime darkness that the British state allegedly moved to sanitize the legacy of Napier Sturt. The intelligence apparatus of the era, primarily the security service known as MI5, was operating with unprecedented, almost dictatorial authority. The outbreak of the Second World War had fundamentally altered the legal landscape of Britain. Under emergency wartime legislation, the government possessed sweeping powers to detain individuals without trial, censor the press, and requisition private property in the name of national defense. The mandate of MI5 was officially to hunt down enemy saboteurs, intercept foreign espionage, and protect the realm from fascist infiltration. However, the definition of protecting the realm was highly elastic. For the directors of British intelligence, a domestic scandal that could severely damage the credibility of the royal family during a fight for national survival was viewed with the exact same gravity as a foreign spy ring. The morale of the British public was the absolute center of gravity for the war effort. If the working class men and women enduring the horrors of the Blitz discovered that the men they were fighting and dying for were deeply entrenched in a hypocritical, illegal underworld, the resulting outrage could have critically destabilized the country. Therefore, when the news of Lord Alington's sudden death in Cairo reached the heavily fortified government offices in Whitehall, the response was not merely one of aristocratic mourning. It was a rapid, calculated assessment of risk. The buffer was gone. The firewall had collapsed. The private residences of the 3rd Baron Alington, previously untouchable sanctuaries of elite privilege, were suddenly viewed as active threat zones containing highly volatile material. The alleged intelligence raid functioned as a methodical state-sponsored extraction. A team of highly trained operatives moving through the blacked-out streets of Mayfair would have approached the Alington townhouse with the quiet authority of men who knew they were above the law. They did not need a conventional police warrant. The defense regulations provided all the justification necessary to bypass the standard legal protocols surrounding a deceased peer's estate. When they breached the heavy doors of the property, they were not searching for enemy codebooks or military blueprints. They were hunting for the physical remnants of human intimacy. By the 1930s, the mass production of personal cameras, like the Kodak Brownie, had made amateur photography widespread. Alongside the traditional written correspondence, Lord Alington's safes likely contained a terrifying new form of evidence: candid photographs. The intelligence officers tasked with this cleanup were likely educated men, drawn from the same upper-middle-class public schools as the government ministers they served. As they forced open the mahogany desk drawers and cracked the heavy iron safes, they would have been confronted with the raw, uncensored reality of the men they considered their social betters. They would have found letters written on thick, expensive aristocratic stationery, detailing secret rendezvous with men from the docks. They might have uncovered extortion notes demanding hundreds of pounds in exchange for silence, scrawled on cheap torn paper by desperate men from the East End. And perhaps most dangerously, they would have found the photographs, images of royal princes stripped of their military uniforms and ceremonial regalia, standing shoulder to shoulder in the relaxed, unguarded company of off-duty guardsmen and merchant sailors. These documents constituted the physical evidence linking the highest echelons of British power to the working-class underworld. For MI5 operatives, these papers represented a severe institutional vulnerability. Their destruction was the standard operating procedure of an establishment program to protect the crown at all costs. The method of destruction, as history strongly suggests, was the systematic incineration of Lord Alington's private archive was a deeply symbolic act. Fire does not merely hide evidence, it chemically alters reality. It turns historical fact into untraceable ash. As the operatives allegedly fed the letters, the diaries, and the photographs into the grand fireplaces of the Mayfair townhouse, they were executing a profound betrayal of memory. By protecting King George VI from the embarrassment of his brother's past, the state actively deleted the lived experiences of the working-class men who had passed through those rooms. The sailors and the laborers, already marginalized and criminalized by the harsh laws of their own country, had their only connection to the historical narrative violently erased. Their names, their faces, and the brief, complex relationships they had formed with men of immense power were reduced to smoke, rising quietly into the blacked-out London sky. This action forces us to confront a chilling contradiction regarding the nature of the Second World War. Millions of British citizens were enduring unimaginable hardship, fighting a total war against fascist regimes to preserve the ideals of freedom, truth, and democratic transparency. Yet simultaneously, the very government demanding their sacrifice was utilizing its intelligence apparatus to deliberately falsify its own history, suppressing the truth to protect a deeply entrenched hypocritical class system. The executors of Lord Alington's will, upon finally gaining access to the property, would have been met with an echoing emptiness. The legal guardians of his estate would have found the financial ledgers perfectly balanced and the public correspondence neatly filed. But the core of the man, the intricate, dangerous, and profoundly human reality of his life, had been surgically removed. They could not protest, nor could they launch an inquiry. To question the missing documents was to question the wartime authority of the state, an act that bordered on treason in 1940. The silence that followed the raid was absolute. It was a silence enforced by the unspoken consensus of the British elite. The aristocrats who had attended Alington's underground gatherings knew exactly what had happened, and they knew that their own survival depended on their continued silence. The royal courtiers who had authorized the cleanup simply closed the file and returned their focus to the war effort. Napier Sturt was swiftly transitioning from a complex living man into a sanitized, manageable myth. However, the complete erasure of a human life is an inherently flawed endeavor. While intelligence agencies can burn paper and melt photographic negatives, they cannot entirely control the sprawling, unpredictable nature of human memory. The sheer scale of Alington's operation meant that too many people had walked through those heavy oak doors. The young men from the docks, the disgruntled former servants, and the peripheral members of the bright young things all carried fragments of the truth in their minds. Though they lived in fear of the Blackmailers' charter and the crushing weight of the establishment, whispered stories began to seep into the oral history of London's underground. In the heavily policed clandestine bars of Soho and the shadowed corners of Hyde Park, the legend of the Baron who hosted kings and sailors refused to die. These oral traditions, passed quietly between men who had to constantly look over their shoulders, formed an invisible parallel archive. It was an archive built not on paper, but on shared trauma, survival, and the stubborn refusal to be completely forgotten. The establishment had successfully neutralized the immediate physical threat, but by destroying the evidence so completely and so unnaturally, they inadvertently highlighted the very thing they were trying to hide. The absolute vacuum left in the historical record regarding Lord Alington's private life became, to future historians, a glaring anomaly. It stands as a dark, unyielding monument to the lengths a ruling class will go to maintain the illusion of its own perfection. We are ultimately left with a clear record of deliberately vanished facts. The legacy of Napier Sturt, the third Baron Alington, serves as a masterclass in state-sponsored silence. When we examine his life and the sudden destruction of his private archive, we are not merely observing one man's hidden desires. We are analyzing the brutal, efficient mechanics of class power. Many historians argue that the British monarchy survived the immense social upheavals of the 20th century precisely because of this ruthless instinct for self-preservation. The establishment viewed the throne as an institution that had to be protected at any human cost. Men like Lord Alington were essential, functional gears within that vast machine. They provided the necessary, highly secure pressure valves for royal indiscretion. He absorbed the risks. He managed the volatile threats of blackmail. He ensured that the extreme moral laws of the land did not touch the men who ruled it. But the fundamental rule of this arrangement was absolute utility. Once that utility ended with his sudden death in Cairo, the machine simply ground his personal history to dust. The British state protected the crown. It felt no obligation to protect the complex humanity of the man who had served it. In the autumn of 1940, British intelligence effectively incinerated Napier Sturt's private archive. This targeted historical deletion of the working class men hidden within the shadow of the establishment stands as stark evidence of how state power obliterates personal history to protect institutional frameworks. Sturt gave his life for the empire, but the empire erased his truth the moment he closed his eyes.